some scholars will tell you whether international economic law is a distinct field of its own or whether it is a branch of um, international law, as we know it. And a common definition you will see is that international economic law refers to the rules governing economic relations at the international level and involving states, international organizations, and private entities. So these are the key actors in the international economic law arena. States, international organizations like the IMF, WTO, World Bank, and private entities, especially multinationals, who are subjects of international economic law, but also increasingly influencers of the legal regimes in that arena. One thing you want to bear in mind as we go forward is that the global economy is interconnected. Of course, there's been a lot of talk about globalization. If you're half my age, I think you would have seen that buzzword everywhere. About the world becoming a global village, interconnection, driven by developments in technology, whether transportation technology, communications technology, so that we are all interconnected. You can stay in your country and consume things produced elsewhere. A clear case of it is this platform where we are having this conversation. We are in different parts of the world and we're able to connect. That this interconnection is not neutral. It delivers benefits, but those benefits are not equitably distributed. And we're looking specifically this morning, how can Africa as a marginal player become a major force, and what role do you have to play in it? How do these interconnectedness, the body of rules that govern the interconnectedness, how do they affect us as Africa and as Africans, and what role you can play in them? Now, in the orthodox international economic law scholarship, you have the pillars, and this is basically founded on the post-World War II international economic order, which was meant to create some form of predictable, stable, efficient global economy that is based on rules, that is based on restraint, basically trying to run away or to avoid the issues that led to the First World War and the Second World War. So the post Second World War international global order, the political and the economy. The political, of course, the UN declaration and all the rest of them. But the economic part of it, founded on the Bretton Woods vision, where you have the key pillars as the trade under the GATT then. GATT 1947, which is different from GATT of 1995 in scope, not so much in substance, but much more in scope. You have of course, the GATT had the basic principles of non-discrimination, that is most favored nation principle and national treatment. Progressive reduction or liberalization of trade was another pillar of the GATT and the WTO regime. WTO succeeded GATT in 1995. We'll talk more about it on another slide. The bilateral investment treaties were basically Western countries and their transnational organizations sought favorable, predictable investment regimes that could enable them to invest, and some people would say enable them to exploit the resources of other countries. So they needed some kind of assurances, legal regimes that could enable that. So that then came the bilateral investment treaties and also the multilateral arrangement under the ICID and the rest of them, just trying to provide investor protection, guide against expropriation, and basically give comfort to the investors, not minding whether the receiving countries had any comfort at all. So I'm wearing a critical lens this morning, so permit me to just cruise along that line. And then you have the financial architecture underpinned by the IMF and the World Bank. Wanted to create financial stability, in prudential regulation of global finance, conditional lending to support development in developing countries, and all that. And some people will say, try to also control the development trajectory of other countries, of the poor countries. Now, these systems determine access to markets, investments, and capital. And this is where the rubber meets the road, because for you to plug into the global system where you could have markets to sell your products or even to buy, or to make investment or to receive investment or to get capital for for certain projects, whether they are infrastructure projects and the rest of them. You need to be plugged into this global financial architecture. You need to be plugged into this international economic order, basically fashioned after the Bretton Woods vision. Now, the core assumptions of this system was a neutral, rules-based system, which benefits all who participate. So it's about rules. Next slide. It's about rules. It's about predictable system. But the question you ask, I think I listened. How many of you listened to the speech of the president of Ghana yesterday at the ONGA? Where he said how the UN was founded, and there were about only 3 or so or 4 African countries that were there in their rights as countries, apart from those who are there as colonial outpost of other bigger countries or developed countries. So those rules were formed without us. Unfortunately, those rules were made without us. We were marginal in contributing to those rules, and I'm going to emphasize that using the WTO paradox, what I've called the WTO paradox. Now, the International Trade Organization is the precursor, or should have been the precursor, to what we have as the WTO. Within the Bretton Woods vision, trade was supposed to be anchored by the International Trade Organization. And one of the core elements or the nucleus of the International Trade Organization was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, 1947. Now, that was being negotiated at parallel with the ITO treaty, which was supposed to form the organization, and then, had a lot of provisions relating to employment, to industrialization, to infant industries, and all that. But the US Congress vetoed the final outcome of GATT 1947, which meant the US was not going to be able to sign it. And since the US was not going to be able to sign it, the other countries couldn't go ahead with that arrangement. But the nucleus of it being the GATT was already negotiated, and they were happy to go ahead with the GATT, which was not an organization. It was basically an agreement. And so the members, people who signed on to GATT and began to implement GATT, which is substantially the same as what you have under the GATT 1994 under the WTO. So about progressive liberalization, the MFN principle, predictability, and all that, and all those rules governing global trade. Now, the tension in the negotiation of the GATT and the ITO was palpable between developed and developing countries. And the major driver of the developing country perspective was India, where they accused the US of basically trying to craft a global trading system that favored US commercial interest. So India was quite resistant to that move. And some of the compromises that were reached in aligning the developed and developing country interest was contained in the ITO. And I've told you that the ITO wasn't adopted eventually. And we'll see that pattern continuing. Now, well, let's go back to that slide. Now, up to the 1970s, especially, there were a lot of movements, especially driven by the call for a new international economic order, and that led to the adoption of the enabling clause in the GATT, allowing developing countries to receive preferential trade agreements from developed countries, and allowing them to also extend preferential trade in the context of regional integration. Now, that enabling clause thing now is in a way reflected within the Article 24 of the GATT that we have today. So the Eurogate rounds was launched in 1986 to have a more robust international trade regime, so to say. Now, it was negotiated, a lot of, happened from one round to the other until Marrakesh in 1994 when it was finalized and adopted. Shortly after its adoption in 1994 and coming to force of WTO in 1995, it was said that there was a need for rebalancing the outcome, of the Eurogate round of negotiation to take into account the interests of developed countries, and that was what led to the establishment of the Doha development round of negotiations. Now, Doha was meant to address issues like agricultural subsidy, for example, stockpiling of agri products for food security. Now, what does that mean? It means that under the existing system, the developed countries were allowed to offer humongous subsidies to their domestic farmers to produce, and those products somehow found their way into the international market, thereby distorting competition with the countries that couldn't afford those level of subsidies. And that was a major issue. There were issues around cotton. There were issues um, around export support, export subsidies that could be given by developing countries to their own industry. So developing countries basically were asking for more policy space to be able, for example, India championed the issue of to be able to buy stock from farmers and stockpile those stock from farmers, you know, uh, to be able to balance price fluctuation. But he called it stockpiling for food security purposes. India kept championing that. It was quite contentious. I think it was until the ministerial in Nairobi that they received a moratorium, a longer moratorium to be able to handle that issue. Now the tension continued, and Doha round couldn't make much progress on the issues that were slated for consideration because the developing countries, especially the US, with their farm subsidies, who are not yielding on cutting subsidies. So the other countries also refused to make concessions on the non-agricultural trade issues that were on the table. Now, while this was happening, we were trying to survey the WTO. Trump came the first time and then said, oh, the WTO is not serving the interest of the US. China has taken it over. WTO is overreaching in its rules. And he found specific issue with the appellate system or with the dispute settlement system under the WTO to say that the dispute settlement system, mind you, which is actually the core of the WTO because it was like a court that gave binding decisions on the jurisprudence of the WTO. But he said that those decisions are overreaching against the interests of the US, promoting the interests of China, and all that. So what did he do? At that moment, there was vacancy to appoint appellate body members in WTO. The US vetoed that. And the way the WTO is structured, in principle, one member state can veto decisions because it's by consensus. So once one member state says we don't agree, others will have to cajole. There are exceptional cases where voting is used, but others will have to cajole that member state into agreeing. And the process of cajoling is the process of negotiations where they say, okay, we'll give you this for you to agree to this. But when we know all the member states in WTO are equal, but I don't want to tell you that in practice they are not all equal. Now, when a country like the US says we don't agree to an issue, every other country will have to stand still. That's the way it works. Well, maybe when a country like maybe well, I don't want to give any example, says we don't agree to an issue, maybe a call from Washington to their head of state, and then a call from the head of state to the guy sitting in Geneva, and the issues will be resolved, and they will agree. You know, now, so the US vetoed the appointment of appellate body members, in a way hamstringing the dispute settlement system. And that has remained the case up to today. Up to today. That was the first coming of Trump. Then the second coming of Trump has seen the use of tariff contrary to the spirit and the letters of the WTO, to promote an American first agenda. So you ask yourself, so without the WTO, what is WTO? What's the future of the WTO? So what you see here is a classical use of power and interest to destabilize an international framework. Now, the international framework was created by the power and influence of countries like the US. Now, when they think it no longer serves their interest, they've also used that same power to destabilize its functioning. Now, that's in summary. Let's look at the WTO and IMF in passing. Some of the issues within the WTO and IMF today about representation and governance, voting rights is skewed in favor of the original founders, the developed countries and the richer countries. The conditionalities could be harmful, or mostly harmful, actually, because those are untested neoliberal economic policies that can work under certain conditions in the laboratory, but those conditions are not usually applicable in real life situations. So the nuances are missed. The culture is missed, context is missed, and when all those things are missed, those conditionalities rarely worked. Now you see the debt trap, they keep lending and lending, and even where the debts are not sustainable. Then there's also the issue of illicit financial flows, the kind of money that goes out of Africa and other developing parts of the world on an annual basis in comparison to what we get as development assistance, what we get in terms of IMF loans or World Bank development loans. Is not commensurate. So you could say, basically, why don't the world come together and decisively address the issue of illicit financial flows so that resources can be localized and utilized where they originate from? Also, the issues around inadequate climate financing. Of course, we know this, it's also skewed. Those who pollute and those who bear the grunt of the pollution are different. So let's go to the next slide. So, I've just given an overview of where we are coming from, what the system, the rules look like. That's our reality where we live. It's a world where power and interest trumps common sense, if you want to put it that way. And then I just want to mention the dominant theoretical lenses in international law that also apply to international economic law. I love realism. I usually say I'm a realist. I wrote my MA thesis in international affairs and strategic studies using the realist theory. Um, Basically, realism is what I have explained in WTO and IMF, World Bank. It basically says that in international system, countries use their power to advance their interest. you know that's it. So if you can, and power in this sense can mean military power, economic power, political power. So once you're able to, you have an interest, you can advance that interest, you apply your power to advance your interest. It really doesn't matter whether it is to the benefit of everybody or not. So it's more like a self-centered approach to making laws. Now, why I say I like it is because it shows you what works in reality, beyond idealism or liberalism, which we are going to see. Um, Realism tells you this is how it is, so you know how to deal with it, so to say. Idealism or liberalism believes in the power of institutions to foster cooperation. So yes, you see how they operate. So WTO is founded on, we need institutions to foster cooperation, create absolute gains for all states. We want to create peace and prosperity for everybody. But when we come down to negotiate the nitty-gritties of those institutions, those who have power ensure that their interests get written into the rules. So tell me, are we dealing with realism or idealism in this sense? Now you also have constructivism, which is basically about ideas and norms. We're seeking development, Pan-Africanism, which is shaping the AfCFTA and other African systems that we're going to see. Yeah, this is constructivism. The emphasis is on ideas. But why I say I like realism and I like talking about realism is that whether you're looking at it from an idealistic perspective, from establishing norms, sharing values, and all that, when we come to the table, power still determines who takes what. QED, that's the bottom line. Power determines who takes what. So now, salute to my twin pioneers. I've mentioned them before. Who is in the room? Dr. Gatti and the rest of them. They've contested the dominant theories of international economic law, and they've introduced the third world approach to it, which is basically a critical school of thought that examines the role of international law in the subjugation and subordination of the global south. So you hear this expression global north and global south, especially within the context of TWIL and international development. The global south talks about developing countries as a whole, and the global north talks about the developed countries. Now, what are the key insights of TWIL? It says international law is not neutral. Yes, it reproduces patterns of global power and derived from colonialism. So you have to look at it from the colonial lens. The colonialism came, it was first explorers who discovered the river behind my backyard, and then from the explorers to trade relationships, from trade relationships to slavery. And I don't know how many of you have come across the work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. So from slavery, which was exploitative, from slavery to trade again, but now under colonial. Yeah, did someone make a comment? Okay, so trade under colonial administration, where the colonial rulers now established governance systems within those colonized countries, and established deeper systems of extraction, where they could get resources, labor resources, to develop their own countries. And you see that legacy in the pattern of infrastructure around Africa, where rails will run from farms and miles to the seaports, where those things are taken away. The concept of cash crops meant to develop industries elsewhere. Mining raw materials and minerals meant to develop resources, meant to develop economies elsewhere. And then those goods, also the finished goods, imported, into Africa and the other countries for our consumption. Now, so the history of international economic law is inseparable from the history of imperialism, which is about colonialism. It's about imperial powers exercising authority, rulership, exploiting the colonized territories. And then the promise of development within the current system often perpetuates dependency. So these are some insights from the TWIL approach to the TWIL perspective or critique of the dominant theories. Now, so where are we? If you look at international economic law in Africa, I've said we're coming from the colonial imprint, which was, we had laws to support extraction, to support the interest of the colonial empires. That's basically what those laws were meant to serve. So we're subjects, or takers of the rules, not makers of the rules. Now, up to the post-colonial time, especially in the 1970s, where you had the call for the new international economic order championed by people like Kwame Nkrumah and other Southern Global South leaders at the UN, especially, because by then the Bretton Woods institutions had become impervious, or had become increasingly difficult for you to champion these ideas within them, and that also led to the creation of the UNCTAD. Apart from the WTO, UNCTAD basically to drive the interest of developing countries, and that. So up to the counter-revolution. Now, when the post-colonial political entities or countries or states we had went bust in the especially in the late 70s and the early 80s, leading to them requiring some form of help to stabilize. Then the Bretton Woods institutions now came again with the Washington Consensus and the structural adjustment programs, the SAPs. Now, this came with a reinstatement of the liberal economic agenda that tells you to privatize, liberalize, cut government spending, this and all that. And most of our countries passed through that phase with little or no result to show for it. And I always have the critique to say that, um, maybe not because if how do I put it? So there were little or no results to show for these structural adjustment programs because they missed the context and because we were quite uncritical in accepting them, because we could have actually fashioned our own systems, when we fell into crisis. And the question of how we fell into the crisis is another thing altogether. So let's go. So next slide. Now, that's what now led us to start thinking probably more critically, if that is it. So there was this Lagos Plan of Action in 1980. It was an African Union blueprint, um, Organization of African Unity then, for self-reliant development in Africa. It was like, let's break away from this dominant global economic order, and start thinking more strategically, more locally, how to develop our continent. And from there, we had the Abuja Treaty of 1991, which then put some of these ideas into a framework, a treaty framework, which became the legal foundation for the African Economic Community. Now, the idea of the Abuja Treaty is that we want to have an African Economic Community by 20, I think by 2028 or something, and to have that, we need regional economic communities to be strengthened, um, to implement free trade, to implement customs unions, and then using that framework, we can then have a common African market, in 2028. But as you see, we've missed most of the deadlines. There were 6 stages that were proposed. From strengthening of the REX by 1999, stabilizing tariffs within the REX by 2007, establishing the free trade agreements and free trade areas and custom unions in the REX by 2017, establishing a continental customs union by 2019, and then establishing a continental economic union by 2023. Then establishing an African Economic and Monetary Union in 2028. Now you can judge where we are on that timeline. So we have the AfCFTA, which is basically stage 3 and part of stage 4 in operation. So we're quite behind the deadline. So what is the AfCFTA? Because today, when we talk about international economic law in Africa, the most prominent foundation or the most prominent instrument, we looked at a bit of the history, where it's coming from, the Lagos Plan of Action to the Abuja Treaty. Now, the culmination, in a way, you could say, is the AfCFTA, because now we're looking at binding rules, legal instruments that could drive those ideas of the past. Now, the legal basis for the AfCFTA, like I've said, is the Abuja Treaty. Basically looking at elements of stage 3 and stage 4 of those 6-stage process. But beyond the legal basis, there's also the policy foundation, which is the Agenda 2063 and the BI80. Which are basically policies that were aimed, in the case of Agenda 2063, a more overarching policy of the Africa we want to see, we want to have by 2063. Africa that is prosperous, that is peaceful, that is well integrated. And then the BI80 is about how do we drive trade and industrialization in Africa. Now, these are foundational elements you can put into the basket of Africa's contemporary international economic law. Now, the AfCFTA is a kind of legal expression setting up a rules-based system of realizing these policy elements of international economic law in Africa. Now, so I'm sure everyone knows about the AfCFTA. It's been the buzzword in the past few years. Um, it is more than a free trade agreement. It's a framework for developmental regionalism. So we're looking at we're asking ourselves, seeing that the global order doesn't favor us, how do we then help ourselves, so to say? How do we come together and look for homegrown approaches to solving our problems and redefining the principles of international economic law for ourselves as Africans? And this is what the AfCFTA is trying to do. So it represents a potential shift from being a rule taker to being a rule maker. That's what we're trying to do. But again, the question is that are we really moving away from the dominant views or principles, or is the AfCFTA another reformulation of those dominant views and principles? Now that's debatable. So let's look at a well-informed view of the AfCFTA. So what from a third word perspective, from a 12 perspective, how do you look at the AfCFTA? What are the issues that we'll be interested in? Um, so the central question will be, is the AfCFTA truly a transformative counter-hegemonic project, or does it risk simply liberalizing the continent for deeper penetration by transnational capital? Um, that's a big question. Liberalization for who? Trade for who? You know, um, the AfCFTA has enormous potentials to drive intra Africa trade. But the reality also is that the bulk of intra-Africa trade is controlled by transnational capital. Now, that's not a problem in itself, because every country at some point of its development required external capital. Either they stole it in form of slavery and resource extraction, or they attracted it in form of investment and diaspora remittance. So, international capital, is um, a major pillar of every country's development, whether it's the US, whether it is Britain, or whether it is, like I said, it's either they stole that capital or they obtained it through investment and diaspora remittance. So it's not a problem that we have an African economy that is, in a way dominated by transnational capital, but are there strategies we can adopt to ensure that the AfCFTA serves the interest of Africa more than serving the interest of external forces? And let's look at some of the examples or some of the issues where this will arise. You could call them some of the grounds of contestation in this analysis. Number one, look at trade in goods. One of the key issues that has held the AfCFTA that has recorded the most prolonged um, um, negotiations within the AfCFTA framework is the rules of origin. It was just concluded about 2 weeks ago in Cairo. And now, why is that the case? Because rules of origin is very sensitive. If you take away rules of origin from a free trade agreement, then the free trade agreement loses its preferential nature. The logic of a free trade agreement is that if country A, B, C, D wants to grant trade preferences among themselves, they want to make sure that the goods, services that benefit from those preferences truly originate from country A, B, C, D, and not from a third country. So rules of origin are the rules that determine the origin of products that can be traded within a free trade area. So take away the rules of origin, a trader in Tunisia can import cars from Germany and then re-export those cars to the rest of Africa um, under the AfCFTA tariff. Tariff free, if in most cases. So you ask yourself, has this served any purpose? Because it's basically re-export, without any value addition. So that's why the negotiators have spent so much time crafting rules of origin, especially in the thorny areas like automobiles, like textile, I think those are the two key issues that have dragged out among all the other issues to say what qualifies a product to be traded under this AFCFTA, so that we don't basically have a Chinese company or an Indian company setting up in Mozambique or Tanzania or in Ghana or in Nigeria, import from their home country, and then basically repackage or rebag it and then export to the rest of Africa. That would have defeated the purpose of promoting intra-regional trade and industrialization and value chains. Another one is looking at investment protocol. How do we address issues relating to investment state dispute settlement? Are we copying the existing international frameworks? Do we want to have a rules-based approach to mainstreaming sustainability into the obligations of investors? Dispute settlement system, the FCFTA is patterned mostly after the WTO dispute settlement system, but that may not be such a big um, issue on its own, because like I've always said, that until we have a rules-based system, then we cannot make progress in driving regional integration in Africa. Then the IP protocol, there were issues around indigenous knowledge, which, happily have now gained recognition and have gained prominence in the work program of WIPO, unlike before. Issues of setting up a common IP system for Africa rather than the country-based or regional-based ARIPO and what's the other name? Can we harmonize them? And how can we ensure that African IP rights are better protected, especially rights relating to indigenous knowledge, relating to um, 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 relating to sorry, I'm trying to remember the expression where you geographic indication, and all that, which are basically foundational safeguards against expropriation of indigenous knowledge and production systems. Okay, so we look at the competition protocol and you say, how do you want to regulate the digital platforms that have pervaded our lives today? We see Nigeria's running battle with Meta on data protection. We see that also happening in South Africa. In fact, we see today um, a Donald Trump in the US who is using the sovereign mind of the US to bully other countries to stop them from enforcing their competition laws against US digital platforms. And you ask yourself, where does that happen? The EU imposes a penalty, and Donald Trump will send out a tweet threatening the European Union with sanctions for imposing a penalty against a private firm just because that private firm is a US firm. Then you ask yourself, where does that leave us as Africans, when we attempt to make such investigations and hold the digital platforms to account? You see power pressing on our neck to make us act against our self-interest. Then you have digital trade. So there are the issues of data protection, but also the issue of localization. Where should we allow free, unhindered data transfer, or should we localize, or should we adopt hybrid systems um, that allow transfer under conditions, and but in all, always maintaining sovereignty. And a friend of mine published a write-up on LinkedIn yesterday, making a case for data sovereignty as control rather than where the data is hosted. So even if the data is hosted in the US or hosted anywhere, making sure that the countries that own that data retain control over the data. Then women and youth. Now, this is like a fresh bread. So we're saying we need to break away from the prevailing global order, where disciplines at the WTO, for example, don't have anything to say about women and youth. And we want to change that trajectory within the AFCFTA. Okay, next slide. So we're saying, how do we, as Africans, make our own international economic law Afrocentric? how far? And mind you, you can't say, oh, you reject everything that is coming from the global order, under the WTO or whatever. No, some of the rules are fundamental. No, but you're saying what rules can we take? What principles can we take? And what principles should we not take? And what principles should we modify in our own context? I forgot to mention to you, like the appointment of the the panel under the AfCFTA dispute settlement mechanism. No one country can veto the appointment of the panel, and that's a clear departure from what is under the WTO, where US has vetoed the constitution of the panel. So at least that's a lesson learned, and a different approach applied. Now, as I wind down, let me look at the future of international economic law in Africa. Now, the challenge is not merely to learn the rules. You are learning the rules. Some of you have done masters and PhD, and know much better than I do in the field. Now, the challenge is not just to learn the rules, but to actively participate in the struggle to rewrite them. What is your intellectual output? What are the critical lenses you're wearing? I'm not overtly I am not, so in the early days of my career, I was an NGO person in the sense that, I joined a lot of We No Go Agree movement, but at some point in my career, I told myself, for how long would you start doing We No Go Agree? Pardon me, my Nigerian lingo. We No Go Agree means we won't agree, Aluta continue. I like struggle. Um, but I asked myself at some point in my career, how is this what you want to do with your life? And I told myself, no, I don't want to do I won't agree. I won't agree. So I needed to move from being oppositional to being propositional. And that meant that I had to go back, pick up the books, dust up the books, and then started immersing myself in the subject, what the issues are, and started creating alternative perspectives, the views. So I was deeply involved in the economic partnership agreement process for Nigeria. So we had to do position papers. We had to do what our national positions are. Instead of just saying we will not partake in this, we are saying this is how we would rather make it to be. So you need to participate actively. Don't join those who stand outside to throw stones at those who are inside to say what you're doing is wrong. Hey, 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 free Africa, free whatever. No, no, I'd rather be those that will break through the doors and get a seat on the table. Get a seat on the table, and you have to be strategic to get that. It doesn't mean you get results when you get a seat on the table, but it means you're making gradual impact, and we'll see how that pans out over time. Now, international economic law in Africa has journeyed from a tool of empire, as we've seen, to a site of anti-colonial resistance, to a framework for neoliberal reform, and now to a potential architecture for continental self-determination. That's where we are right now. How do we fashion the rules to serve our purpose, and standing on it as our springboard to engage the world outside us. Now, the ongoing contestation, the fundamental tension between IEL that serves global capital and an IEL that serves African people remains. It's a process. It's an ongoing contest, and we need to find our place within that contest. Now, what is your role? Africa needs a new generation of lawyers, scholars, and policymakers who are historically informed, so you know where we're coming from, theoretically critical, so you can wear your theoretical lenses and look at the prevailing practices and principles and critique them, and politically conscious. You understand that power is an important element within this discourse. Next slide. I think that should be my last slide. So I'll end, with this note on the imperative of developmental regionalism, which is what we have actually set out to achieve within the AfCFTA. Now, this must be founded on responsible and responsive governance at the national level. I'll tell you something, you know, um, when we critique slave trade, let me go back there a bit. When we critique slave trade and the role of the Western world in slave trade, do we devote much effort to critiquing the role of local chiefs and kingdoms in slave trade? Do we develop that much attention? Do we devote that much attention? You know, to say that they were not just people stopping and coming to our shores to buy slaves, but there were also our people who would go to the hinterland to fight wars, kidnap people, abduct them, and bring them to the shores to sell to the slave buyers. So there is an element of of cooperation, if you like, even if it's within some unequal power relations. Now resistance does not admit cooptation, into the act of the oppressor. Once you allow yourself to be co-opted, then you're not totally innocent there. So look at the resources in Africa. Look at the and look at our governance outcome. Look at enormous resources. We have a country or a company can fly into your capital, have a meeting with some politicians, sign some documents or sign no documents, some bundles of dollars exchange hands, and the country is sold. So we need the kind of leadership that doesn't just talk about exploitation at the global level, but leadership that resists exploitation at the global level. And you say, oh, if you resist, they will kill you. Well, by the time all of us resist, they can't possibly kill all of us. So they would always look for the weak links within us to exploit, to divide. So what's the problem? We need to build our people. We need to be responsive and responsible in governance to be able to regain our voice and then use this voice to advance our own interests. Now you say there's strength in numbers. Regionalism is about numbers, it's about creating a larger market, about creating a stronger voice. But you know, not just population, not just population. You could have the population, but if you don't have the human capital, if you don't have the economic outcomes, your economic growth, your infrastructure and all that. If you look at the countries that were at the same level with at independence, look at the South Koreas, look at the Malaysias of this world, the Indonesias of this world, they've gone far ahead of most of African countries that were even better than them at independence. Now the question is, were those countries also not part of the skilled global economic system? If they were, how did they then escape? But we couldn't escape. How did they make tremendous progress? But we've not been able to make tremendous progress. So we should be self-critical in the analysis. We should put ourselves on the spot and ask ourselves, how have we been enablers or contributors to where we find ourselves as marginal players, as exploited players within the international economic order? Now, so we need to keep building deeper integration in trade, in finance, in infrastructure, in energy, in skills, etc., with a Pan-African vision, because we realize that our strength lies in our numbers, our collectivity as a people. Now we need to find a way to keep pushing this integration. If you look at it today, we've had a lot of processes. Okay, look at how far we followed behind in the 6 stages under the EAC. Can we have a generation that takes it up passionately, and say we are going to drive this process forward? Now, so that means we need to have an intergenerational mindset. We've more often had leaders that say, oh, as long as, I get some money, get some houses in Switzerland and the UK, buy some fancy shoes, fly private aircraft, the next generation is not my problem. What happens, is not my problem. We need to have an intergenerational mindset. It is knowing that it is the effort of women and men of goodwill across time, across space, and on different issues, that's across matter, that eventually deliver change for one generation. So when you see an outcome in a generation, it's a combination of the successes and the failures of the past generations. And when you see positive outcome for one generation, it's a culmination of the successes and the failures of the efforts and the omissions of the generations to come. So right now we are at the juncture where Africa seems to be saying we want to be serious, you know. So in our different efforts as scholars, as practitioners, as conscious citizens, you know, as civic leaders, can we then make it a personal commitment, you know, to drive these processes, you know, to drive these processes to a place where we can say we are building for, even not for our generation, for the next generation. I'm sure many of us don't think in terms of that, to say, oh, you know, maybe I'm 20, 25, 30 years old now. Do you ask yourself, what would Africa look like in the next 1,500 years? That's the way I think. I think intergenerational. I think of what's Africa going to look like in the next 50 years, and what can I do today to contribute to that Africa that I want to see in 2063, even if by then I'm no longer here, or if by then I'm bent with old age, you know. And if you look at all the developed countries, whether China, US, you look at all of them, they think in generations, 50 years, 100 years. They do scenario mapping, you know, they do, you'll be shocked, but it's strategy. That is how it works. At this juncture, I think I've spoken a lot, so I'll take my break, and thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very, very much, for your presentation. That was truly very enlightening, very energizing.
Hi, Choma. There's an echo. There's a bit of an echo from your end.
Oh, sorry. I don't know why that is.
You have a second device there. You can mute your second device. Turn down the volume on your second device. Now we can't hear you at all. Okay.
Okay, is it better now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, great. So thank you very much, sir, for that very wonderful presentation. I'm sure I, at least, and I'm sure all of us here have a lot of learnings, and we have so much knowledge, so much information, particularly on, you know, international economic law, its foundations, and just so many things that we thoroughly feel very enriched today. So much knowledge, in fact. So we will be moving now to the Q&A session, and we don't seem to have too many questions. However, we do have two questions from someone who, I hope I do not butcher your name, Wendy Am. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. Yeah. So the first question that Wendy Am has is, do you not think that the multilateral trading system is brain dead? And then the second one is, do you think that the AfCFTA is compatible with the EPAs concluded with the European Union? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that question. So before, let me not mix up my years. I think the Kenyan WTO ministerial was in 2019. I'm not sure. Anyone who is sure could post it on that. So I was one of those who declared the Doha development round dead before Kenya. You know, because again, I wasn't a diplomat, so I didn't owe any obligation to speak diplomatically. I was basically talking as a practitioner and as an academic. So when people were saying, "Oh, you know, we can salvage Doha," I looked at it, especially when I was writing my MA thesis in 2015, 16. You know, and I just said Doha was dead. I didn't see how the countries were going to yield on the different positions, you know. And if you listen to me properly, Doha development round was the round of negotiations launched to salvage the WTO, to serve the interest of developing countries, rather than, so kind of rebalancing, you know, the WTO. And at that point, because of the divergence in the position of the developed countries and developing countries, I just knew that Doha wouldn't succeed. And if Doha didn't succeed, then that would have marked a fundamental crack in the architecture of WTO. And that was what happened. So the failure of Doha, which nobody talks about at the WTO now, so they allowed it to die a slow, unannounced death. So he died without an obituary and without a formal funeral. Now, what has happened after that with the US intervention from the first era of Trump to the next era of Trump? You could as well say that the WTO is dead. But it is not totally dead because some countries are trying to see what they can salvage out of it. But the WTO, as we knew it, as founded in 1995, is dead. Quote me on that. Something else could come out of it, but no longer the old system, because the balance of power in that system has changed against the big countries. So they can't have their way any longer. And since they can't have their way any longer, you can't have your way. So that's what is happening there. When Biden took over from Trump, and that was when our sister Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala was coming into the system. I think I had a TV interview then asking me what I thought, and I told them basically that Trump was anti-WTO, anti-China. Trump wanted to veto the appointment of Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. Trump was a bit disruptive in his dealing, but not as disruptive as he is right now in his second coming. But I told the person asked me, did you think there was going to be a change in the attitude of the US seeing that Biden is coming? I told the person, no. No, because there was a bipartisan consensus in the US that the WTO was not serving the interests of the US and that China was getting more than its fair share. So what I told the person was going to happen is this, that you will see a US that plays more on the ground, not as antagonistic as Trump, but still maintaining the same position on the same issues as Trump did. And that was what Biden did, So in this, yeah, you could say the WTO as we knew it is dead. We are basically trying to see what could come out of it. Now, so where does that leave the AfCFTA now? So that means the lesson from the if you like, from the apparent demise or the alleged demise of the WTO, the lesson is that our way forward lies in regional integration, the AfCFTA. We need to consolidate. We need to not just in the writing the rules, but in the projects and the processes that can drive real trade and economic activities, in infrastructure, in regional value chains, in rules harmonization, making the AfCFTA binding and a rules-based system where countries that fail to live by their obligations could be brought to a real court system, not political settlement as we've always done before, and we need, again, the countries who have the means, more means than other countries, to drive this process. Now, in terms of the EPA, if you Google online, I had an article in the EPA in the early days of my career. The article trended globally and caused a lot of trouble. It's about, I can't remember. It's I think I used the name. No, the publishers used Leo Ugbajah to publish that article. I wrote with my boss at that time. The EPA and the parable of the elephant or something like that. I can't remember. And what we argued then was that the EPA was not fit for Africa. It was not fit for purpose. And it couldn't, we were against the imposition of the EPA on Africa, especially the way the EU was going about it at that moment. Of course, I can tell you the story. So eventually Nigeria refused to sign for West Africa, and that meant there was no West African EPA, because EPA was meant to be regional basis. So the West African one, the Southern African one, the EAC one, and the rest of them. Now, so there's no West African EPA, but there are EPAs signed by Ghana and by Cote d'Ivoire. Under the AfCFTA framework, a member state cannot sign a trade agreement with another country that is contrary to the to the obligations under the AfCFTA. That's number one. Then number two, a member of the a state party to the AfCFTA cannot grant more favorable trade preferences to another country than they are granting to African countries under the EPA. So in a way, you could say they are incompatible, but the incompatibility will have to be looked at in terms of what preferences are offered. Unfortunately, I've not looked at that, So if Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire, in the case of West Africa, for example, is offering more favorable preferences to the EU under the AfCFTA than they are offering under the AfCFTA, then it will be incompatible. Now, but apart from this case of outright incompatibility, there's also this issue of multiplicity of legal regimes within a regional economic community. So in ECOWAS, for example, Nigeria is trading with the EU under the GST. That's the GSP, the General System of Preferences, and then Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana are trading with the EU under their EPAs. Then mind you that we have a customs union where we're supposed to be having an uniform tariff treatment for all imports coming into West Africa. So yeah, it already causes some imbalance. Now, what I will expect going forward is that once the AfCFTAs are firmed up, the AfCFTA, the AU should negotiate with the EU for a continent-wide trade agreement that is anchored on the AfCFTA, not the country level or regional level EPAs. So that means all areas of incompatibility would have to be smoothened out within that continent-wide trade agreement with the European Union. Now, of course, you cannot escape trade agreements. It's the reality of our world. The question is, what do you get in terms of trade agreements? So yeah, so the EPAs in a way, and again, I've had people say that the Kenyan EPA with the EU has issues relating to the AfCFTA. I have not explored it, but yes, the potential for conflict and contradiction is there. I will acknowledge that. But it is not automatic because the AfCFTA doesn't prohibit you outrightly from negotiating trade agreements with the external countries. It's just the rule of compatibility. It has to be compatible.
Okay, thank you very much, sir, for your very insightful and comprehensive answers to the questions. So, I have two questions that I'm very curious about, and I think could really help all of us in the audience. And just from your background to begin with, we've worked with countries across Africa, Western Africa, East Africa. And when you were talking about the theoretical lens, I got very curious, particularly, what do you think is number one, like the prevailing theoretical lens across Africa, when it comes to international economic law? And second of all, with that knowledge in mind, do you propose that there should be, since you said that we are propositional rather than oppositional, do you propose that there should be a shift that would help us to not only just, create better rules, but also implement better rules?
Okay, I wish I could say there's a prevailing theoretical lens or approach to international economic law in Africa, especially within the public sector. Unfortunately, no. Unfortunately, no. I'm thinking of the most benign way to say this. But I'll say this, that it is the case that mostly in the public sector, people are not critically engaged in these issues as you're doing here. So it's a question of uh policy, move files here, and most times we use consultants to sort out these kind of complicated issues. And the challenge is that if you have the outcome you get from a consultant aligns with a consultant's theoretical lens. And the consultant's theoretical lens is not necessarily the country's theoretical lens, but because there's no critical engagement with that process of consulting output, so we become takers. Will become takers, So yeah, there's an increasing realization of the need for us as Africans to look after our own selves, to look after our own interests and all that. But how does that translate from an idea, from a proposition into policies or into negotiating positions, you know? And where you have people in the public sector who have this understanding of the need for us to promote African interests, they also have the challenge of dealing with the power element of it. So beyond the director or the officer who has a progressive idea, you know, how do you sell that idea as a negotiating position sitting in Geneva when your minister is just off from a meeting with the ambassador of the European Union of the US where they have discussed which position to advance? So you see the challenge. Number one is the capacity challenge. Number two is the power challenge. How do you address these issues? And that's why forums like this are quite important, you know, that until we have people at the top level, at the intermediate level, at the low level of public service who think critically about these issues and who think strategically about these issues, then we'll lack a common approach. So we'll keep building. We're building. So the short form answer will be that we're building our approach as a continent towards this, you know, so that we don't get always caught off guard when this happens. Have I answered all your questions? I think I missed a leg of it.
I mean, you have, considering that we are building, I guess it will still, whatever it is that we come up with will now help us to determine what policies and implementation practices work best for us. So thank you very much. We also have two final questions. I hope these questions are from Daniel. And his first question is that, so he says he works on government contracts and would like to know if this type of contract is included in international economic law.
Procurement. So
Then,
public procurement is covered under the WTO, but it is in the species of agreements called plurilateral agreement. So in the WTO, you have two types of agreements: multilateral. It's basically multilateral, so everything is binding on all member states. But beyond that, a few member states felt they wanted to negotiate binding commitments on other areas that all the other member states are not equally interested in. So one of them is public procurement agreement. The other one is telecoms. Telecoms or energy or something. Telecoms. So yes, public procurement is covered under the WTO, and it's about liberalizing access to public procurement and tenders among the signatories to the public procurement agreement. Yes.
thank you. Then the final question says, also from Daniel, how does international economic law take environmental imperatives into account?
Okay, that's interesting. So yes, in principle, international economic law takes environmental considerations into account. Looking at, for example, the WTO, you know, so you have like the fisheries agreement. You know, one of the objectives is to curb overfishing. You know, and fishing subsidies that drive overfishing. You know, which destabilizes or destroys the marine ecosystem and all that. So you see those kind of issues coming into account. Even in issues of competition law, there's a lot of talk about integrating environment and sustainability consideration in merger control. It's gained a lot of prominence, especially in the EU, where they will look at the environmental implications of an agreement between two companies to say, well, if it is going to promote environmental sustainability, we can close one eye and approve this merger, even though there are some other issues we could raise. So yes, it's gaining prominence, but it's not still mainstreamed as it ought to be. Also in the WTO, issues dealing when you come to the general exceptions under the WTO. So for issues dealing with animal health, human health, plant health, and all that, which are then further elaborated under the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement. Those all relate to environmental sustainability. But again, there's this siloed approach to international rule making where issues are dealt with at different fora. So, for example, environment is dealt with at a different fora altogether under the COP system and all that. But the idea is to make sure that these things are intertwined and integrated, and they are beginning to become so. So that you have the WTO, the World Bank system, um, giving bite to environmental and sustainability considerations in their rules and in their programs. Even though I must say, when it comes to global financing, they push it sometimes beyond reasonable limits. So, for example, the funding fossil fuel exploration in Africa in the name of environmental sustainability. Um, what do you want us to rely on? Rely on renewable energy. Yes, the whole world is building capacity in renewable energy. But come on, you did not develop your own economy with renewable energy. So why must we be the ones that must get stuck, with the renewable energy? So yes, for good, the international economic law considers environmental sustainability, but sometimes it also becomes a point of driving agenda that is not in the interest of developing countries. Yeah. I must also say, like the carbon adjustment border measures introduced by the European Union, so all manner of rules that you want to promote climate and environmental sustainability, but the impact of those rules in developing countries, would be costly, much more than the benefit you're going to get as the country applying those rules.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. So we have three final questions that we'll take before we close out the fireside chats. The first one is from Oyindamola Ajay. Oh, let's just say Oyindamola. It's kind of long, but in summary, so she says that on one hand, there are older commitments like trade agreements, WTO rules, and contracts with foreign investors, which might prevent new tariffs, limit subsidies, and even allow foreign investors to sue states if their new policies affect their profits. And she says that on the other hand, the AfCFTA is giving African states more freedom to trade with one another and set their development agenda, which presents some tensions. So how do we now harmonize or address those tensions?
Well, I'm not sure I understand where those tensions are. So the way I don't see the tensions as being between the AfCFTA and the other agreements. I see the tensions existing within each of those systems. So, for example, at the multilateral level, there's the investment rules are supposed to protect mostly the interest of the investors, actually, and then you're asking, how do you then balance the interest of the investors with the interest of the receiving states? I think that's where I see the tension exist, and that's why most times what you're looking at is that how again, that's where governance comes in. With predictable, efficient, responsive governance, you have eliminated one of the obstacles to investment flow. You know, you have your rule of law, you have that, then you don't then need elaborate mechanisms for investor protection. So investors look at your market, they say, oh, the economy here is functioning, the legal system is functioning well, we can invest there. Most of the padded rules the investors look for are to protect them against what they perceive as investment risk within your country. So for me, what I would say is that make your economy investment friendly, not just for foreign investors, but also for domestic investors, and then negotiate sensibly, to ensure that you don't give away too much. That you don't give away too much. Retain the space for policy and policy changes, even when those policy changes will affect the investment they affect the profitability of investors, so that you don't expose yourself to ISDS unnecessarily. And we've seen a lot of that happen when investors sue countries for introducing regulations to protect health, for example, anti-smoking regulations. Yeah. Also, under the AFCFTA, those tensions will also exist, really. Maybe we've not looked at it that critical, because an average manufacturer, like I know, apologies to the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria. We had serious issues with them when we were negotiating the AFCFTA, because when Nigeria was supposed to sign on, there was a lot of outcry. They said, no, we've not been consulted. This is going to lead to the death of Nigerian manufacturers. It's going to lead for... So even within ourselves, we still have those tensions in play within ourselves. So the question is, in every trade agreement, like in every commercial relationship, or in every personal relationship, it's a process of give and take. You should be able to know what you can give and what you can take, and what you cannot take, and what you cannot give. And that's why it is a negotiation. So we arrive at least a place where everybody is minimally comfortable with the outcome. Then we'll build from there, because sometimes the hesitation is derived from our inability to forecast what the future will be. So you're hesitating to say, if I sign on to this agreement, will it benefit me in the future? So it's okay, let's take it piecemeal, gradual liberalization. So as we liberalize, and if it looks good, if it works out well, we can do more. We can go more into harmonizing domestic policies. We can go more into... So in essence, my answer would be, the tension exists within each of these systems, and that's why negotiating those systems is actually more important. And in negotiation, you then have to pay attention to the power imbalance in the negotiation, to make sure that the big guys don't get all they want, and then the small guys go home with empty plates. That's where the problem starts, really.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your answers. So we'll go to the next question, which is from Dennis. So he asks that, can we really speak of an international economic order in light of the rise of protectionism, in particular the resurgence of trade defense practices and customs surcharges?
Yeah, what we can, of course, there's international economic, it's there, but I tell you, it's usually the playing field of how do I say it? It's okay. So it's usually the field of contest. It's always been contested. It will continue to be contested, and in a contest, the guy who comes to the battle with a gun, and the guy who comes to the battle with a knife are not the same. So the system is there, but the outcome would always, be skewed towards the more powerful entity. Now, when the WTO became difficult or tough for the powerful countries to manipulate for their own end, then they started beating strategic withdrawal and going more towards unilateral action. That's what you're seeing the US doing. That's basically what you're seeing. So you can no longer beat this system, or you can no longer fashion this system according to your image to do what you want. Then you withdraw from it, and then because you have the power, you start using unilateral action to intimidate other countries to doing what you want. So that's... the system is there. It is... the system is there, but it is not a self-executing, self-enforcing system. It still depends to a larger extent, and that's why it's different from the national legal system. The international legal system is still dependent a lot on the goodwill of the states within that system. It's not self-executing. The nearest to being a self-executing system is WTO, but now we've seen that the WTO has also been bastardized. So yeah, so it really, for me, I would say, and that has been my approach for quite a few years now. I pay very little attention to the things that happen in the international system, and I pay more attention to things that happen within the African system, because I just told myself that if we need to make progress, then we need to build. We need to build for Africa. We need to build in Africa. So when you dissipate a lot of intellectual and whatever effort looking at, theorizing about the international system, it will cause you a lot of headache, I tell you, because it doesn't make sense, really.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Um, and the notes that you mentioned, or the statement you made about building for Africa, is actually relevant to the next question, which I'm sure is something that has been on all of us' minds. So the question is that the creation of the AfCFTA seemed to us to be a path to success for all of Africa, but why has it remained theoretically conceived so far?
Well, I don't know if I agree with you that it is theoretically conceived so far. So, of course, everything will have to start as a theory, as an idea. But there's been some progress made in the AfCFTA. Even if some of us would have expected more more to have been done at this point. But again, it also comes to the point of how we have always approached regional integration in Africa. We've always been good with signing documents, with making declarations, but when it comes to the implementation, there's always a problem. If I were to be in a position to drive this process today, sometimes I ask myself, so if I had all the powers like a Superman, to drive regional integration in Africa, what am I going to do? I'll basically write African regional integration into the constitution of every member state, basically, you know, and make it domestically enforceable, and that is driving the hands or twisting the arms of the political actors within the member states to pay attention and to implement, the rules within the member states. I think I have a short essay on LinkedIn on rules-based approach to regional integration or something. I can't remember exactly, but if Miracles could search it out, you could post it here. Now, we usually I don't blame the people at the bureaucracy. They do all the bits they can do. They convene the meetings, they do the good talks, the summits, they issue the declarations, they do the research, but driving this process beyond theory lies with the member states, lies with the political consensus and the political action by the member states. Now, if we have leaders like you who understand that this is Africa's do or die moment, or this is what Africa needs to survive, and you're committed to driving that, sometimes against the political economic current of the actors within your own country. That's what we need, because sometimes when those leaders come and sign those documents and make those commitments, they go back home, and then they have to contend with the manufacturers associations, they have to contend with the business association, they have to contend with one businessman who funds their election, and all that. And then before you know it, everything falls apart, So we need right people leading the charge at the national level and at the regional level, doing the right things. Sometimes it's something that concerns me a lot. It's something that gives me some thought and sleepless night to say, how do we move from all these initiatives, all these agreements, all these processes to having concrete outcomes, but again, I believe in gradualism, so we'll keep on it. I'll keep on it. So if you're disappointed that it hasn't achieved much than it has done right now, I share to an extent in that disappointment, but we can't give up. We are the generation that must not give up.
I agree. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir, for that. Yeah. Oh, okay. So we have now come to the end of the fireside chat. We've come to the end of your session. As a note of thanks, we want to say thank you very much for your presence. Thank you very much for your lecture. Thank you for answering our questions to the best of your ability, and for in fact, this was a very exciting session, very insightful. We're so lucky to hear from someone with your wealth of experience. I'll now be handing over to Miracle for a closing notes before we conclude finally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chama. Thank you, sir, for this session. I mean, that balance of being a practitioner. I know you're saying you're not an academic here.
No, I'm not smart
That's
enough
a
like
fake
many of you.
news,
I'm just
ladies and
aspiring.
gentlemen. That's a fake news, oh, ladies and gentlemen. Please, he has the perfect balance of being a practitioner and an academic and a scholar. And it showed in this presentation because you've had hands-on experience, with this navigating these issues, and you've also, researched them and written extensively about them. So thank you so much. And while you were even speaking about not giving up, I remembered something that has stayed with me over the years. Every time I start to just think about all the issues and how, we may not be making as much progress as I desired. When I first started working in this area, I had so much pessimism, especially the very first time I did the trial course on reading and interpreting international agreements, and the focus was on the AFCFTA. It's like, this is another document that is not taking us anywhere. And I was just filled with so much pessimism. But I remember one day that I walked into your office and I was just asking, you've been doing this work for so many years. How do you retain hope? Doing all this research, writing reports, we are having, studies and validation workshop, and we're having all these stakeholder engagements. It looks like we're doing, we're doing all this work, but the implementation is still moving at such a speed that is not so encouraging. And I was just so distressed by it. I'm wondering how somebody can be doing this for decades and still fired up and still showing up with so much energy. And you said something to me that day that I've never forgotten, and it stays with me every time. You were saying that your own work, you will do your own work, right? You will do your own work of doing your research, writing what needs to be written, providing the roadmap, thinking in terms of strategy, just probing things critically and providing a roadmap, hoping that one day the leader who needs to, do what needs to be done will show up. And that day, when they show up and they are looking for, okay, now I'm willing and I'm ready to do this thing. What do I need? Who can put tools in my hands? And you'd have already done that hard work so that that leader who has the political will to do the hard work would, move and get the work done. And it was such a light bulb moment for me. It was like, okay, that's an interesting way to think about how the work you're doing has meaning. You may not see it in the moment, but a day is coming. And we even see that with Nigerian landscape. We have a trade minister now who has done the work. She's not just an academic professor, but she has done great work in the field. And you've also had personal experience working with her on, with PEBEC. And she's there, and obviously she needs tools to do the work. And all that work you've done in PEBEC is providing, some roadmap for her work now, because she has the political will and she has the knowledge to do what needs to be done and drive the change. So that's such a great perspective that we should hold. I know that the AFCFTA, people are, cautiously optimistic, as we should. People are distressed, but let's keep the hope alive. And even through forums like this, as we continue to sharpen our minds, as we continue to engage with people who are, not just talking the talk, they are walking the walk, like Mr. Leo here, we are also encouraged ourselves, and we see what the future holds, and we continue to press on in study and in practice. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for really pouring and answering all our questions and the slides as well. We really appreciate you taking the time. And thank you to everyone who showed up for this session today. I really, really hope that you found it to be valuable. I'm expecting to see, pieces on LinkedIn talking about what you learned today. My mind is buzzing. I have so much to think about. And yeah, let's take what we've learned today and do something with it. That's how we know that we really, really learned something today. So thank you, everyone. We would release you to continue to enjoy the rest of your Saturday. Thank you, sir. I hope your family, your family will bear with us for taking you away this Saturday.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, see you next month for another session of Afronomicslab. Cheers, everyone. Have a great afternoon. If you have